I saw a pretty funny tweet over the weekend from the new socialist Democrat media darling Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She says, there's nothing like walking into the bodega, grabbing an iced cafecito, chopping it up with everyone behind the counter, and appreciating the dude who's blasting Oye Como Va through his backpack speaker. In this small moment, nothing else matters. Today is a good day. Someone's trying just a little bit too hard. Ay, bendita. So this is an interesting tweet. I made fun of it a little bit earlier, but one thing that struck me about this tweet is it's just sort of the ridiculousness of a socialist essentially praising and using all of these things that the market produces. In other words, you know, she goes into the bodega, which itself is a market miracle, has products from around the world all at her corner store and at reasonable prices. Now, if you've ever been to a bodega, you know that the prices are pretty high compared to other markets, but still very reasonable prices. She grabs her iced cafecito made with coffee, sugar, milk. These are all things that the prices have been, you know, the real prices anyway, have been, you know, reduced by like 60–80%, something like that, over the last 100 years because of the miracles of market production and private ownership. Even the dude with the backpack speaker, probably an MP3 player connected to that. The size of these, the quality of these products has gone so high, and you can have an entire music library in the palm of your hand, as opposed to those big boom boxes from the 80s, which stylistically were way better. But the Oye Como Va thing, even the backpack speaker, these are things that the prices have dropped ridiculous amounts while the quality goes up ridiculous amounts. And so everything that she's talking about here, even the computer that she's writing this on, or she probably did it on a smartphone, which is even more of a miracle of the market, but everything about this tweet all talks about the absolute amazing miracles of capitalism and the marketplace. And this is all coming from the lips of a socialist, or at least a wannabe socialist. I found that kind of funny. Now, if you are astute, you know that the prices of you know, food and things like that have actually gone up. You know, I just did some quick research on the prices of milk, and so in 1913 the prices of milk was like 35 cents a gallon, and now it's $3.50 a gallon. That's 900% growth. The price of coffee was about 30 cents a gallon in a pound in 1913. Now it's about $6. That's like 1,800% growth. Sugar, very similar, about 1,000% growth. But the thing is, though, that this is all primarily because of inflation. Actually, the prices of these things have gone down in real terms, because if you look at the average income in 1913, it was about $800 a year. Now it's about $33,000 a year, which is about a 4,000% increase. And so the actual price of the food has gone down, just like the prices of you know, computers and speakers and audio equipment in the last, you know, 20–30 years has gone tremendously down while the quality goes up. And so these are all market miracles. Now, inflation, on the other hand, that's a more complicated story, because a socialist, a good socialist like Alexandria, would want to increase the money supply in order to pay for all of her ridiculous projects and social engineering. And that, of course, raises the money supply, which is what drives the prices up. All you need to do is to look at a amazing example of socialism like Venezuela to see that this is not a good idea. But anyway, I wanted to talk about this today because socialism is something that's becoming more popular in Christian circles. It's always been somewhat popular in Christian circles, but it is not a biblical method at all. Here's a few tweets from Jamar Tisby, where this is, you know, this is the thing. We're in a place right now where if you call a social justice warrior a Marxist or a socialist, people get really mad at you. But the mask is starting to slip. I think what we're going to see in the next coming elections is at least at a very minimum basis, sort of an idea that socialism is actually a neutral position for a Christian. So a Christian can be a socialist, even if they shouldn't necessarily be one. That's actually not true. Socialism is not moral at all. It's not morally neutral. It's actually an evil system of thought. It's an evil system of economics. But here's a few tweets from Jamar Tisby that kind of show you where he's coming from, and I think it'll be a lot more explicit in the coming months, and actually especially so with the upcoming presidential election in a couple years. Here's one that says, "Public funds have always relieved more people than private ones. Voluntarism never was and never will be an adequate answer to the problem of dependence." Public funds to be used for, to take from rich people, give it to the poor people, that's actually not something the Bible condones at all. The Bible condones charity, voluntary charity, and it's not strictly voluntary. Here's the other thing that I think Christians need to really pay attention to. The Bible does not condone the government taking funds from people in order to give to others. That's sort of the kind of charity that Jamar is talking about here. These public funds would be taken by force. That's not something the Bible actually supports. I had a guy tell me that an example of socialism in the Bible is the gleaning law. And the thing about the gleaning laws was God said that the Israelites were supposed to leave a certain amount of their fields, the edges of their fields, so that the poor could go in and take food as they needed it. But there was no penalty attached if they didn't do it. So in other words, the government couldn't force you to let people glean in your field. But it wasn't really voluntary either, because God said you should do it. And so in other words, voluntary charity to the poor, people who are more destitute and in need, that's not really voluntary per se. As a Christian, you have to do it. But it's also not something that the government can take. So there's no public funds for that kind of thing. So even the idea of Jamar accepting the idea of public funds for that kind of thing is itself an evil idea, a wicked idea, a socialist idea. Here's another tweet from Jamar that I thought was interesting. Actually, I misplaced it here, but anyway, it's a tweet from Martin Luther King Jr. A quote from him that talks about how he, whatever you call it, socialism, social democrats, whatever it is, that there's got to be a more equitable distribution of wealth than what we currently have. And that's a very socialist type, Marxist type idea, as if Jamar or Martin Luther King Jr. or anybody knows what the proper equitable distribution of wealth is. Nobody knows that. And see, here's the thing. So I mentioned Venezuela earlier, and if you look at the prices in Venezuela, they're out of control. Inflation has completely taken over. But it's really inflation in the black markets because Venezuela has price controls. Venezuela has a price that sugar is to be sold at. Venezuela has minimum wages, and they've raised the minimum wage many times in the last few years. But that's a price control over a wage, as if the government knows what a proper wage is. And that's something that's part of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's platform. She wants to have Medicare for everyone, wants to have free education for everyone, free, and price controls on wages and things like that. Probably other things as well, if you actually ask her. But see, the thing is, and she would probably say, well, we won't do it the way that Hugo Chavez did it in Venezuela. And the thing is there any reason to think that Alexandria understands the prices and the market, or I'm sorry, economics better than Hugo Chavez? I don't think that there is. In fact, that's not an insult. Nobody does, because nobody knows what the right price should be except for the people buying and selling, except for the market. The market is the only thing that can set a price with any kind of knowledge. A person doesn't know that. It's not an insult to Alexandria to say she has no idea what the proper wage should be. She says it should be $15 an hour. That's just a random guess, because when you have a minimum wage, you set the minimum wage at $15 an hour, what you're doing is saying, well, if your skills aren't worth $15 an hour, well, then you can't work. That's a ridiculous, it's an arbitrary price. And so these ideas that Alexandria, these are not new ideas, as she mentioned, and they don't work. That's the other thing. If you look at Medicare and how ridiculous Medicare, I mentioned the price of food going down, I mentioned the price of electronics going down. But the price of healthcare has skyrocketed over the similar periods of time. And the reason is because the government is involved. The government heavily regulates. The government increases the demand without increasing the supply. And when you do that kind of thing, of course, the price is going to go up. And so for everyday Joes like me who pay their Medicare out of pocket with cash, we're kind of in a weird spot where we have to pay tons of money for something that's artificially inflated because the government is involved in setting prices and all these things. Alexandria says these ideas are good ideas. They're terrible ideas. And so over the coming months, I'm going to talk about the biblical principles regarding socialism and economics and things like that. And see, Jamar Tisby, right now he's not promoting socialism. He kind of is, but he's kind of just presented it there as this is sort of this neutral thing. It's not neutral. It's not biblical. It's actually anti-biblical. Even Jesus himself said that the only person that can set a price is the person who owns the money or owns the product. And so, for example, in the parable of the workers in the vineyard, he says that the workers all agreed to work for a certain amount of money. That was their right. They owned their labor, so they could sell it for however much they want. And the owner of the field decided to pay what he wanted because the money was his. He wanted some labor and he had the money, and so there was a free exchange there that Jesus assumes when he tells that parable. And, you know, I've had social justice warriors say, well, that's not really about economics. Of course it's not about economics, but if the economic principle isn't correct, then the spiritual principle isn't correct. Jesus assumed these things. You have the right to sell your labor for what you want to, and you have the right to pay for labor what you want to. That's a market. And we need to demonstrate that upcoming, because I think the social justice warriors are already very heavily invested in economics of this whole thing, but I think it's going to increase. And so we're going to get people, big names probably, that are going to come out supporting socialists, and that's going to be a big problem for everyone. Anyway, I hope this is helpful. God bless.